We have all been accustomed to make fun of cold molasses, but this experience taught us that cold molasses has death-dealing and destructive powers equal to the tornado or the cyclone when it is suddenly unloosed. This dramatic claim was spoken by Damon Hall, the prosecutor for the civil case against the company U.S. Industrial Alcohol, following the Boston molasses flood of 1919. This disaster, which left 21 civilians dead and 150 injured, has faded into the footnotes of history. Its perpetrator, Molasses, doesn't seem capable of causing such damage and pain. However, the Boston molasses flood had a lasting impact. By bringing attention to the poor standards for engineering projects in the late 1800s, the Boston molasses flood furthered workers' and immigrants' rights to work in safe environments and participate in class action suits, underscoring corporations' responsibility to utilize stricter building codes. In the early 1900s, the United States was still in the grip of the Gilded Age, a period marked by hands-off government and free-for-all laissez-faire capitalism. As Mark Twain remarked sarcastically in 1871, "What is the chief end of man? To get rich. In what way? Dishonestly if we can, honestly if we must." The name of the game was profit, and the outbreak of World War I in 1914 only furthered the call for productivity. The European allies needed resources, and the United States mobilized in order to provide. Molasses was an especially useful material, as it could be used as a cheap substitute for sugar or converted to industrial alcohol and used in explosives for the war. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company, or USIA for short, capitalized on this need. After the war, they continued trying to sell as much alcohol as possible before the implementation of the 18th Amendment, which banned the sale of alcohol. They shipped hundreds of tons of molasses up and down the East Coast, including to one specific tank in Boston's North End. This neighborhood, just off the Boston Harbor, was founded in the early 1630s. It was one of Boston's oldest neighborhoods and hosted many upper-class residents, including Paul Revere. However, after the Industrial Revolution, many of the inhabitants began moving out, and in the late 1800s, the neighborhood became a center for lower-income immigrants, especially from Italy. These immigrants faced discrimination at every turn. The laissez-faire capitalism of the time left little space for the voices of poor workers. Additionally, nativism was rising because of World War I, and Italians specifically were targeted due to the small yet prevalent group of radical Italian anarchists based in the North End. These anarchists sowed chaos with their violent actions, like the bombing of a local police station, which made many wary of all Italian immigrants. Their struggles were exacerbated by the fact that around 60% of residents in the North End weren't citizens and didn't have the right to vote. Thus, they had extremely limited say in the happenings of their own neighborhood, including the future construction of the molasses tank. The tank was initially ordered by the USIA in early 1915 under the oversight of Arthur P. Gell. Gell's crew rushed to build the tank, a massive 50-foot steel structure, before New Year's Eve of 1916, when the first load of molasses would arrive from Cuba. This stress to complete the tank on time, as well as Gell's incompetence surrounding engineering, meant that many safety precautions were completely ignored. For example, while testing for leaks, Gell only put in 6 inches of water instead of the required 50 feet. The steel of the tank was also made thinner than needed to cut costs. In December, due to the lack of any safety equipment, a laborer fell 40 feet while working on the tank and died, the first of the tank's many fatalities. Due to the business's irresponsible actions during construction, the tank had many problems throughout its 3 years of operations. It began leaking almost immediately, and instead of fixing it, the USIA painted the tank brown to hide the molasses stains. The leakage and later concerning rumbling noises continued to persist all the way until January 15, 1919, when the USIA's negligence would have dire consequences. At 12:30 on January 15, 1919, people around Boston heard a giant rumbling sound, akin to a train passing by. These sounds were caused by a buildup of gas within the tank from the molasses' fermentation, due to unusually high January temperatures and a new load of heated molasses the previous day. Suddenly, an ear-splitting boom rang through the city as the rivets holding the tank together flew out, and all 2.3 million gallons of molasses rushed out in a huge wave. The speed of the Molasses reached 35 miles per hour as it surged through the north end. It smashed into anything in its path, including a fire tower that collapsed directly onto a group of firefighters, and the Boston Elevated Railway, which was completely obliterated. The Boston Globe's report the following day described how persons walking along Commercial Street were picked up by a rush of air and hurled many feet, many to be severely injured by heavy timbers and other debris which fell on them. After the main wave had dissipated, Bostonians were left with the mass destruction of a disaster unlike anyone had ever seen before.
The flood story knocks off the front page the Prohibition Amendment and the Versailles Treaty, the end of World War I.
In some places, there were 2 to 3 feet of stagnant molasses. People, animals, and debris were stuck in the sticky substance, and often so bogged down by molasses that identification was impossible. Local emergency services launched into action, creating makeshift hospitals to put victims. However, due to the deaths from World War I and the Spanish flu, local personnel were stretched thin. For 4 days, they worked tirelessly to rescue victims. But as the cold January air hardened the molasses, they were left with the daunting task of cleanup. City officials were eventually able to clear the molasses, but the damage had been done. 21 people were killed, some indirectly with infected wounds sustained from the flood, and some directly by drowning in the molasses. 2 of the victims were children. In total, 150 people were injured. Someone needed to be held responsible. Thus, the survivors mobilized to seek justice for the dead and for those left with debilitating injuries. A collection of 119 separate lawsuits were combined into a single civil action lawsuit against the one responsible for it all, United States Industrial Alcohol. The company fought hard against these accusations, stretching the lawsuit out for 3 years, unwilling to take responsibility for their negligence. They spent $50,000 on expert witnesses alone, trying to convince the judge that the tank had exploded due to a bombing by the Italian anarchists instead of their lack of building codes and safety measures. However, the judge, Hugh Ogden, was extremely diligent in his oversight of the case. In a very shocking decision for the time, the USIA was held responsible for their misdeeds and were forced to pay $628,000 in damages. Even after the physical repercussions of the flood had faded to nothing more than a faint scent of molasses in the air, the workers present did not forget the incident. The Boston molasses flood revealed a critical flaw in the way corporations were run. Building regulations were simply too lax, and companies were not being held responsible for the safety of their workers. So, people began to push for change, hoping to establish a new precedent for workers' rights. In the major civil lawsuit following the flood, the judge ruled against big businesses, further cementing workers' rights to safe conditions. In major cases that followed, like Erie Railroad Company v. Tompkins and Railroad Express Agency Incorporated v. New York, judges and juries followed in Ogden's footsteps, ruling against corporations. The disaster also led to the creation of better building codes, which was another critical step in ensuring safe workplaces. Starting as early as 1920, the Boston Building Department began creating stricter codes. Initially, they focused on tanks, especially of oil, but eventually these codes became more varied and widespread. In 1927, for example, the Uniform Building Code consolidated building codes in residential buildings, so workers across the country were protected. All of these advancements helped to solidify the push for workers' rights, especially for immigrant workers.
It starts in Boston and Massachusetts and ripples across the country, is that almost everything we've come to take for granted in the building construction industry today is as a result of this disaster.
The Boston molasses flood was a regional tragedy with lingering national impacts. In a twisted simulacrum of the phrase, "safety regulations are written in blood," many were written instead in molasses. USIA's lack of responsibility was not unique to that company. Many other companies also neglected to make sure their products were safe and denied the rights of their workers. The Boston molasses flood brought this devastating phenomenon to the spotlight. It saved an untold number of lives as preventative safety regulations were put in place, and empowered people to more thoroughly defend their right to a safe working environment, as the big business involved was for the first time deemed responsible for its mistakes.
What's unique about it is it's really the first time that I would say people without power had a real voice, in such a massive civil lawsuit.
Despite its relative obscurity, the Boston Molasses Flood extended both the rights of immigrants and workers and the responsibilities of big businesses, preventing further tragedies like it.